Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I'll be running you through the final boss of the Amirdrassil raid and the Dragonflight expansion on normal and heroic difficulty, FYRAKK the Blazing. I'll go through all three phases and the intermission of the fight here, showing you the different abilities you're going to have to deal with in each of them and how I actually recommend you handle them. I'll also be putting out mythic raid guides on my channel as well, so if that interests you, be sure to subscribe and click on that notification bell. Otherwise, let's start with, well, the start, phase 1, where it is basically a race to push the boss to 70% health before he fills the platform with wildfire burning Amirdrassil. Because of this, early on in progression, I do recommend bloodlusting here just so you can see later on in the fight, but once you start getting consistently into that third and final phase and you're comfortable making this DPS check in P1, I definitely think it's better to lust at the end of the fight. Back to that fire though, throughout this phase, FYRAKK is going to be using wildfire, and this deals some raid damage and spawns raging flames in a line across the room. On top of this, he will occasionally mark a few players with Firestorm, and this causes a 9-yard impact around them after a few seconds, which leaves behind raging flame puddles. Make sure that these marked players move towards the already existing fire on the ground and just drop their new puddles right next to these already old ones just to maximize space. Note that also during this Firestorm cast, there's going to be a bunch of swirlies that everyone just needs to dodge. I recommend tanking the boss relatively close to the current line of fire. Just leave a little bit of space for any potentially debuffed players to just move in and drop their own puddles without crowding the boss too much. You'll also want to be off towards one of the sides of the platform here, with the range just positioned in the center of the room, as this allows them to ignore the Dream Rend mechanic. Basically, when this is cast, the raid eats a hit of fire damage and a rift opens up, slowly dragging players in and dealing ticking damage reduced by distance. By having these open up on one of the sides of the platform, it means that these range can just plant in the middle of the room and not worry about running out of this effect, though note of course that melee will either need to use like a warlock gate or any other form of mobility they have to move out quickly, otherwise they will actually be incinerated by the center of this rift, which does not sound good. I do not recommend it. For some additional damage healers need to handle, Burning Presence pulses every 2 seconds during both this phase and P2, and notably this will also put out magic debuffs on random players in a flame, which ramp up the longer they are out and active on players, so you want to make sure you're dispelling these as quickly as you can, meaning access to things like mass dispels, revival, or even things like the dwarf racial can be very powerful on this boss. On heroic difficulty, you also need to worry about the blaze ability in all three phases of this fight, which just goes out on random players and shoots a line of fire through them after 4 seconds. To deal with this, I recommend a strategy used by players back on the Mythic Sylvanas encounter, if anyone remembers the Death Knives mechanic, but basically the debuffed players spend the first 1.5 to 2 seconds of the debuff duration moving away from other players, then for the last 2 seconds of the debuff, they plant so that everyone knows the exact location this line is going to shoot out in. This allows any players that may still be in the path to react quickly to the positioning of the effect, as it's now 100% predictable. What you don't want to do is be constantly moving with this or move at the last second even just before the detonation goes out, as this can make it really hard for other players to actually avoid it. Also note that the player targeted by this ability has no way to avoid the impact themselves, so they're always going to be taking that Shadow Flame damage hit, so use a personal here if your health is low. For tanks, the debuff you'll be dealing with is Fearless Bite. This is a mixed physical and Shadow Flame hit that shoots out flame in a line as well, and debuffs the tank with Fearless Mark, causing the boss's melee attacks to deal additional Shadow Flame damage. You want to taunt off here at 2 stacks of this debuff, so just keep in mind that when you are actually tanking the boss with a stack on you, you're going to be taking a decent chunk of additional Shadow Flame damage. Also, since there's a line attack attached to this ability, make sure you're facing this boss away from your raid, which is fairly easy to do because, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to want to be tanking this boss on one of the sides of the platform. Also, something else to note for tanks is the Predator ability, which basically just makes the boss leap to you if you're ever out of his range. So it'll be fun to see DPS players who pull before the timer end up having the boss jump straight to their face. After pushing the boss to 70% HP, he'll use Incarnate, jumping up into the air and then slamming back down in dragon form, knocking players up and dealing some physical damage to them, so just make sure everyone is topped when the intermission starts. To get through this intermission and start phase 2, you'll need to actually break the shield FYRAKK places on himself when he uses Corrupt on Amirdrassil. You have 30 seconds to do so, or of course it is a wipe. While this shield holds, FYRAKK will deal increasing ticking damage each second and will also incinerate any players directly underneath him, so make sure you are standing a little bit back. His hitbox is fairly big, so not a big deal, you won't be out of range. On top of this, there's additional ticking damage from burning scales and also shadow flame orbs that will spawn in an arc around the boss and float towards him, dealing a large raid hit and applying a dot to everyone if they actually collide with FYRAKK. Make sure you have your raid just fan out around the boss and soak these orbs to prevent this from happening. In total, there are 3 waves of orbs that spawn during this intermission, and the damage of soaking is actually decently high, so we opted to assign immunities to the bulk of the soaks. Things like Bubble, Turtle, Netherwalk, and even Ice Cold for mages are great here. The room is pretty big, so we actually assigned 6 players total, 1 to cover each the area around the boss's left foot and the boss's right foot for every single wave, so again 6 total there, and then basically the rest of the raid just played goalie around FYRAKK, letting any straggler orbs that the immune soakers missed to make sure they get soaked. It's not the end of the world if you don't have immunities here, as you can just assign players with large defensives or even tanks as well, especially as you get more gear later on in the tier and these hits become less scary. After breaking the shield, the boss will once again fly up into the air, this time using Flamefall on the far side of the platform, and this will deal Shadow Flame damage to the raid, again reduced by distance, so just hang out near where the boss just was in the intermission to decrease the damage this ability does, as he will quickly jump right back to the tanks like I mentioned with that Predator passive. Just like in phase 1 here, you're going to have to deal with that Burning Presence raid damage, the Flame magic debuffs that come with it, the Fearless Bite tank buster, and on Heroic, those Blaze lines. On top of all that, you also need to worry about the health of the Heart of Amirdrassil here, which is constantly ticking down throughout this phase, and of course, if it reaches 0, you wipe. In order to heal it up, you actually need to have healers top up the packs of friendly spirits of the Kaldori that spawn on the far end of the room and just slowly walk towards the heart, as these will heal the heart for whatever their HP is whenever they reach it. Notably, these NPCs can actually be hit by many of the abilities in this phase, which is bad news, as if killed it will convert them into hostile mobs. This includes things like the tank frontal and those blaze lines. This means that you'll miss out on any potential heart healing they would have done, so make sure that players are aware of where these mobs are in any given time, and note that when they are fully healed, they actually gain a life force barrier, so the faster healers top up these adds, the less other players need to worry about their positioning and where these abilities are shooting towards. Outside of that pesky healer stuff, FYRAKK will occasionally cast a powered up greater firestorm, spawning again a bunch of swirlies that you need to avoid just like in P1, but also putting a 9-yard AoE around both tanks, which explodes after a few seconds and spawns a burning colossus that again, each tank will need to pick up. These guys have a mixed physical and Shadow Flame tank buster in Molten Gauntlet, and they will also constantly tick for raid damage from their pulsing core, so you want to make sure basically these are the priority target of your damage whenever they're alive. Also on top of this, if they ever reach 100 energy, they'll use Exploding Core, which is likely to lead to a wipe, so yet another reason to focus these down. Now, shortly after using this greater firestorm ability, FYRAKK is actually going to jump up into the air and use Shadow Flame Devastation. This is just a massive line on the floor in a set location, so make sure you get out of this if you are in it for any reason. Then get ready to move towards the many Screaming Soul adds that have spawned from it. These mobs just channel Searing Screams, which deals Shadow Flame damage every 3 seconds to nearby players or spirits, and gain a stacking 20% damage increase in the process. Luckily, this cast is both interruptible and the mobs are fully CCable, so that opens up some counterplay. Now, where things get a bit tricky is that there is a spawn of friendly spirits shortly after this breath and these hostile adds spawn, meaning that they would path right through a cluster of these spam casting ads, likely dying and converting to enemies in the process. To stop this, have someone call where the friendly spirits are kind of spawning from, then use things like knockbacks or grips to move the hostile ads out of the path of the friendly spirits. Things like Typhoon, Blast Wave, and Wing Buffet are fantastic here, along with their respective empowering talents, as they're always going to be available every single time one of these overlaps happens, whereas something like A-Bomb's Limb, while extremely powerful, is likely only going to be available for one of these overlaps. In a pinch as well, long duration stuns if there's like one or two hostile mobs that you missed, as it will prevent the mobs from casting for the duration of that stun, potentially allowing the spirits to pass them. To give you an idea of what this looks like with a diagram, if that's helpful, here's a raid plan I drew up on raidplan.io. You've got the standard tanking position at the top, the breath line that spawns the ads in the middle, and then I've also marked several lanes at the bottom where the friendly spirits seem to be spawning from. Again, the spawns were relatively consistent for us when we did this fight, where usually on the first breath overlap, we had our spirits spawning in the middle at the triangle marker on this image. Then for the second breath, the spirits seem to either spawn at the circle or the diamond marker, but again, could be a coincidence, so be prepared for varied spawns. But basically, the goal here is to just clear the lane the spirits are walking through, so if you get to spawn at triangle as an example, like we did, you just want to make sure that you knock back the ads around triangle in that line away, ideally in the same direction. So using what we did again as an example, we knocked these ads to diamond every single time, and then we brought those currently still alive infernals to the diamond marker, and then used death grips and another knockback on the ads over on the square marker just to stack everything up on one little pile and nuked them down with AoE damage. Once all the screaming souls on that half of the room had been defeated, we then drag the living infernals, who are usually very, very low health, if not dead at this point, to the opposite side of the room, to the star and circle marker, and just kill all of those ads while the boss is spawning. Note here that the boss casts Flamefall once again here before returning to the platform, and you're likely going to be quite close to the AoE when this happens, so just be ready to use a personal if you're low. Once you've defeated all of the ads, you can make your way back to that initial tanking position in the middle. Tanks, just be careful again of those frontals when you do so. From here on out, this phase just repeats with the boss phase followed by that ad phase until you either push the boss to 40% HP or 3.5 minutes have elapsed, at which point he will once again use Incarnate and then begin phase 3. Shortly after entering this final phase, you'll notice 4 seeds of Amirdrassil spawn around the boss, which players can pick up by running over, and then they can drop by using their extra action button. Importantly, if any Shadow Flame ability ever hits these seeds or hits the player carrying the seed, they will become blazing seeds, pulsing for raid damage and then dissipating. On normal, this damage wasn't too high, but on heroic, this will require heavy healing and defensives to live through, so try your best to not have this happen. I recommend assigning 2 players to each seed, allowing them to work together to keep their seed away from any Shadow Flame, similar to Halandra's bombs, if you remember that boss fight. Remember that if you are targeted by the Blaze ability, which does exist in this phase, you do take Shadow Flame damage yourself, so if you're carrying a seed, make sure you drop it and then move your beam away from it so that your partner can safely pick it back up. Keeping these seeds around is very important, as they are your main lifeline for the Apocalypse Roar ability, which deals a lethal hit of Shadow Flame damage to all players, pushes them back, and applies a 12-second dot to them. While this ability is being cast, if you're carrying a seed, your extra action button will no longer cause you to drop the seed, but instead will cause it to bloom, creating a 9-yard circle for 6 seconds that absorbs the next 1 million incoming damage, making this otherwise lethal hit extremely manageable. This also consumes the seed entirely in the process, meaning you want to make sure you're only using 1 single seed per cast of this roar, as it happens multiple times over the course of this phase. That means you'll need to have an assigned central stack point to run to so that your entire raid can get into just a single seed circle, again only 9 yards big. Then have one of your seed holders assigned to usually use their extra action button during the Apocalypse Roar to protect your entire group. Since this point needs to be accessible to your entire raid, it's best to just kind of loosely fan out around the boss, ensuring you're able to get to that stack point quickly when the cast starts. Also, be aware of potential range issues here, since this is a pretty large platform and the boss itself has a very, very large hitbox, so don't stray too far from your healers. Alongside the seeds, we've got the returning blaze lines like I mentioned, and the burning scales raid damage, plus Firestorm has evolved one more time, now becoming Eternal Firestorm. On top of the swirlies it spawns like in every other phase, the debuffed players will now also spawn a swirling firestorm that spins around the location of the detonation, knocking back and dealing heavy damage to any one hit. I recommend running these debuffs out as far as you possibly can over to the edges of the platform, as this allows you to mostly ignore the tornadoes that spawn from them, as they'll just be spinning out of range of the raid who's stacked closer to where the actual boss is. Having one of these drop in the middle of the room is very, very bad, so avoid this at all costs. Also, because these deal Shadow Flame damage, remember that if you're targeted by one of the debuffs from this ability and you're a seed carrier, make sure that you drop your seed for your partner before running out to the edge of the platform to drop your tornado. Know that this cast also will usually come shortly before an apocalypse roar when those do happen, so it's important that no one is standing on top of the assigned stack spot beforehand, as this can cause them to potentially bait those swirlies that we talked about right on top of that stack spot, so something you want to avoid. The tank hit in this phase has also changed. It's now Infernal Maw, and this is a massive physical hit that also applies a stacking Shadow Flame dot with no duration, so you're stuck with this for the rest of the fight, meaning you're going to be taking increasing ticking damage as this phase goes on. This ability comes in sets of 2, then has a decent gap before another set of 2 is cast, so I recommend just taunting such that each tank takes one hit from each of these sets of 2, just so no one gets wombo comboed basically with 2 large hits back to back. You can opt to just have a taunt after each of these combos instead, and the benefit here is potentially with this method, you can use one massive DR ability to cover both of these hits and survive that combo just fine, though in general this feels a bit more dangerous and kind of depends on your tank comp. Outside of this, there's just one more ability you need to worry about in this phase in Shadow Flame Breath, which is similar to Razageth's Breath attack, as it targets a random player and after a short delay shoots a beam of energy in their direction, which you just want to avoid. Again, you're going to be relatively close to the boss in this phase anyway, so this should be quite easy to just sidestep. Otherwise, this fight is just a race to kill the boss before you run out of seeds to live through those Apocalypse Roar casts, though I will say, if you stack enough raid defensives, think like a barrier, like with a rally, personals, etc., it is actually possible to live through one of these casts without a seed, so keep that in mind if you ever end up accidentally losing a seed to a Shadow Flame hit, or you're pushed late in the fight and are out of seeds entirely. But that is it for my normal and heroic FYRAKK guide. Hopefully it helps you guys earn your ahead of the curve achievement and mount skin, and if it did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like it, including Mythic boss guides, as well as tons of Mythic Plus related guides as well. If you have any questions about this boss, please drop them down in the comments below and I'll do my best to help, or you can ask me over on my Twitch channel at Tactics, where I stream all of my own Mythic raid progression and Mythic Plus key pushing. Of course, I have to thank my fantastic Patreon supporters for everything they do. It really does mean a lot, and I'll see everyone in the next video.